Well, I want to welcome everyone to the first 1,000 days of life, setting the stage for equity. This is a virtual seminar co-organized by the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience Program and Trauma Free New York City, both at Columbia University. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society and the chair of Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience. I want to thank you all very much for joining us for today's event. This seminar series is a part of the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program, which is housed in the Center for Science and Society, a hub for researchers, scholars, and practitioners seeking to break down traditional disciplinary silos and to enhance public understanding of science in relation to pressing social concerns. The Presidential Scholars Program facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior. It brings together talented early career scholars from a variety of fields with faculty experts in neuroscience, as well as in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The program supports independent postdoctoral fellows, seed funding for cross-departmental research, and a variety of seminars and conferences and other events, most of which are now online. I just want to highlight very quickly our upcoming seed grant deadline for interdisciplinary research projects in society and neuroscience. They're due December 21st, and these grants are available to Columbia and Barnard faculty, to postdocs, senior graduate students with faculty support. They'll provide up to $50,000 of funding, as you can see, and for 2021, special priority will be given to proposals that additionally focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Please visit our website, linked in the chat box, for more information about these grants, all our programming, and you can also find our full video archive of events like the one today. Additionally, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, follow us on social media in order to receive the spring schedule for these events, which should be coming out very soon. I want to thank our faculty leadership, scholars, and partners like Trauma Free NYC, who have helped to make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement. If you enjoy today's free event, we appreciate small donations, which will enable us to live stream our public events once we return to in-person seminars, which I hope will be very soon. And now I would like to ask Virginia Rauh, Professor of Population and Family Health at Columbia University and co-director of the Trauma Free NYC, to tell you briefly about the initiative and to introduce our moderator. Professor Rauh.
Thanks, Pamela. I want to say a few words about Trauma Free NYC. We are a group of faculty across Columbia University who are committed to promoting awareness, research, and training about the science and the effects of trauma on sources of resilience. The next slide shows our mission.
I don't seem to be able to advance, Virginia.
Which I can easily explain. Trauma Free NYC aims to bring together New Yorkers who are committed to creating trauma-informed partnerships across the city. We promote the integration of scientific advances regarding the causes and effects of trauma into the work of any organization, individual, or public servant actively involved in the well-being of New Yorkers. The next slide shows what we do, simply a summary. We serve as a scientific advisor and resource to policymakers, practitioners, and the public in New York City. We promote research and demonstration activities on the meaningful solutions to mitigate the harmful effects of childhood adversity. And finally, we design educational training and service learning programs in trauma-informed practice at Columbia University. We also have a very active student-led group, which volunteers and is engaged in some grassroots activities as well as research activities. I would like next to introduce our moderator for this evening. Dr. Maureen Allwood, today's moderator, is a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York, CUNY, and a doctoral faculty of CUNY's Graduate Center. She is also an adjunct associate professor of the Heilbrunn Department of Population and Family Health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Allwood's NIH-funded research focuses on the developmental effects of trauma and violence exposure, particularly for youth living in high-stress urban communities. She's interested in how multiple factors, such as cognitive, emotional, and physiological factors, interact to predict negative outcomes, such as school failure, delinquency, substance use, poor mental health, poor physical health, and suicide among trauma-exposed youth. Her work also focuses on the impact of trauma exposure on vulnerable populations and the accessibility of effective treatment services, with emphasis on the needs of low-income communities of color and immigrant and refugee communities. Welcome, Dr. Allwood.
Thank you, Dr. Rauh, for that warm introduction. Really appreciate it. Now, it's my honor to be with you today and to moderate this webinar. There are more than 100 of us here together. We might not be able to see each other or see the full group, but we will still have a lively discussion thanks to this technology platform. At any time during the talk, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and share your questions with us. We will have about 20 minutes for discussion of your questions later in the program. For today's webinar, first, we will hear from our esteemed speaker, Brenda Blasingame. Then, as the moderator, I'll have a few discussion points and a few questions for Ms. Blasingame. Then we'll follow with your questions to the speaker. To help facilitate our Q&A discussion, the Q&A chat box will be moderated by Dr. Danielle Kaskow, who we'll hear from later. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Brenda Blasingame, who will be our speaker for today. Ms. Blasingame has her bachelor's degree in developmental psychology from Rollins College, often referred to as the Harvard of the South. She has her master's degree in organizational psychology from John F. Kennedy University. Ms. Blasingame has worked at the executive and senior levels in public-private partnerships and public and nonprofit sectors. She has served on numerous boards, and task force at the local, state, and national levels. She is a published author, a training facilitator, and a highly sought after public speaker. For the last 20 years, Ms. Blasingame's work has focused on early childhood development, and she has prioritized and applied her expertise to issues of equity. Ms. Blasingame is the founding executive director of First Five Contra Costa, an agency focused on early childhood development in California. She subsequently moved to Washington State, where she was a founding staff member of Thrive Washington. She also served as the Senior Director of Programs and Partnerships in the United States Division of Save the Children. There she managed the prenatal through elementary school education and psychosocial programming. Ms. Blasingame has served as the Executive Director for Health Connect One, where she was responsible for leading this national organization's work on peer-to-peer support during the first 1,000 days. This work focused on developing strategies to achieve birth equity, community-level systems change, and advocacy for maternal, infant, and early childhood health and wellness in communities that are marginalized as a result of social oppression. Most recently, Ms. Blasingame joined JB and MK Pritzker Family Foundation as a program officer on the Pritzker Children's Initiative team. The Children's Initiative is a national effort to support children's healthy development and school readiness by age 3. The initiative aims to equitably expand high-quality services to at least 1 million low-income infant, children, and families. Through all of her various leadership positions, Brenda has leveraged her expertise in early childhood development, focusing specifically on children and families who have been marginalized and have been made vulnerable by inequities. In sum, her life's work has been to create opportunities to achieve equity and social justice so that children have what they need for a healthy, thriving life. Please welcome our speaker, Brenda Blasingame. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. We're reaching the evening time. I'm actually in Chicago. I'm very honored to be here with you today. And I am going to move to sharing my screen. So it is really wonderful to be here with everybody. Thank you for joining us as we spend the next bit of time talking about the first 1,000 days of life, and specifically talking some about equity and focusing our work on equity. So I want to begin today by, as I always do, by acknowledging the land on which Columbia University sits and the indigenous communities who call and have called that land their home. And this is very important that we do this for me, because history is not always in the past. It does live with us in different ways, and with some of us more than others in the present. So this is the tribe that was the original inhabitants in New York. Now, I'd like to take a few minutes and tell you about where I work. You heard a little bit about where I work. I have been there for 8 months, so I myself am an infant in my work at the foundation, yet in the field, I am in no way a young one. I've been working in the general field of social change and social justice, approaching 3 decades, and specifically for the last 2 decades, I have worked in early childhood. So I want to do a quick overview of PCI and our work, and then move forward with our conversation. So this is the vision that PCI has. And this vision is a universal vision. This vision is for each and every single child in the United States. This is our big, hairy, audacious goal, our BHAG. Is it incredibly hard? Yes, it is. Is it impossible? No. You might be wondering why we chose such a huge goal. We chose this huge goal because marginal change is just not good enough. When we look at what is happening globally and in our part of the world, in our communities across our country, we know that we should be doing better. And we want to do better, and we have to do better. As every day someone gets pregnant, every day someone goes into labor, every day somewhere in this country a baby is born, or a child has their first, second, or third birthday. Time is moving forward, but it's really important that we not move at the speed of time. It's important that we move at light speed. If we move at the speed of time, that means we're going to get incremental marginal change. If we move at the speed of light, it means that we're going to bring about transformation to our practices, our policies, and our systems. Because we need it now. We need this transformation to happen right away, because children can't wait for 2 or 5 or 10 years from now for us to get it together. We believe that without our BHAG, that we would only be focused on marginal and incremental change. I used to work with a boss who would say, it's not rocket science, you know, because we already figured out how to power a rocket to another planet. Early childhood systems building is harder. Yet we know we can do it, as we've seen progress in many different places across the country. So the caveat and the little disclaimer I want to give before I jump into the meat of today's discussion is that we don't have enough time to do more than explore the tip of this iceberg together. In terms of the depth of knowledge and what exists in the terms of the topics that I'm going to touch on, we won't get to the depth that we would all want to get to and that I love getting to. So you will not get all of the answers, but I hope to give you an overarching view in to the world of the first 1,000 days and to the issue of creating equity for all children. I am a big lover of quotes, and I want to start with this quote. I think the quotes are important. They help to inspire us and to also help us to aspire to new places and vantage points in our thinking. Always growing, always learning. That's what being a human being is about. Urie Bronfenbrenner was a world-renowned child psychologist, and he developed the concept of the ecology of human development. It transformed practice in terms of what was effective in terms of working with children. Urie was Urie was a pioneer in terms of many things, in terms of studying the behavior of children in their natural life space of family, school, peer groups, and community. He's also known as a co-founder of Head Start, which is celebrating more than 50 years of touching the lives of many children across the country. So now we're going to move into talking about the first 1,000 days and what it means to build a human. That's how I think about it. We're building humans because babies are just smaller humans and adults are bigger humans. And when Urie Bronfenbrenner was thinking about his ecological theory, if you envision in your head nested circles coming out, there were 5 systems that he talked about and that he named. The first system, in the middle of those circles, is a child, a baby, an infant. And then that first circle closest to that baby is what we call the microsystem, which is where family, peers, neighborhood surroundings, religious community, childcare, school, a number of things are in the daily life of that child. When you move out from that to the next system, it's the mesosystem. And the mesosystem is all about the interconnections between the microsystem, such as parents and family with teachers, parents, family with pediatricians, extended family members, other families and their children. So we have the mesosystem. And then when we move out from the mesosystem, we move to the ecosystem. And this is a system that doesn't involve that child that's at the center of everything, but it involves adults and older persons in the family unit. And this is where we're looking at things like media politics, neighbors, social services, work. And nowadays we would probably put social media in that system also. And from there, we move out to the next circle out is the macro system. And this is really about the attitudes and the ideologies of culture, such as geographic location, whether you live rurally, urbanly, suburbanly, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, all those kinds of things. And then the final system is called the chronosystem. And the chronosystem is really about the environment and patterns of environmental events and transitions over the life course of someone. And so that could be divorce. This could also be, if you think about the changing status of women working outside of the home over time. And in 2020, the chronosystem would be about the pandemic and the civil rights protests that we have been seeing all over the globe and in our country. So the microsystem is the most influential level of the ecological system theory in terms of young children and influences the building of each of us as human beings. So I want to start by talking about the major things that happen in the first 1,000 days. I think the first 1,000 days are this amazing, beautiful picture of nature and symmetry and things that, so many things that we are still getting to learn about and to understand. It's during the early years, especially the first 1,000 days, that new neural connections are being formed. And as you can see from this graphic and from the heading, they're being formed at a rapid rate of speed. And they're happening through a combination of genes, environment, and experiences. Brain architecture is being built every single second. And with that foundation that's being built comes all future learning, behavior, and health for each of us as an individual. The brain is developing and the ability to change at this point, which is called brain plasticity. I always have trouble with that word, is really high. And the effort it takes to change during this period of our lives is very low. So we used to think that children were just sitting there, and now we know they're sponges and absorbing everything around them at every single second, every moment. But over time in our lives, as we get older, what changes is our brain's ability to change becomes less, and the effort to change becomes more. That's where we get the saying, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So early connections provide either a strong or a weak foundation for later connections that we have. And all of the connections that are happening in our brain come through what we're experiencing in the environment. And they happen through bonding and attachment. So everything about early childhood, everything about infants, everything about toddlers is all about relationships. For years, I had this magnet on my refrigerator while my kids were growing up as a reminder to me about my relationship with them. And sometimes we would come to it and talk and have conversations when I was parenting them in one way or another. And so attachment theory really was developed by the person that we call the father of attachment, which is John Bowlby. And John Bowlby, sorry, I did it again. Sorry about that. John Bowlby said this about attachment. Intimate attachments to other human beings are the hub around which a person's life revolves, not only as an infant or a toddler or a school child, but throughout adolescence and years of maturity as well, and on into old age. So what gets set in place here around attachment is in place. It becomes a foundation that follows us through for the rest of our life. And young babies' brains are developing in the context of relationship and connection. And part of that is through the bonding and attachment that is happening with the adults that are their caregivers. So it is not ever a question of whether or not attachment happens, it's how it happens. So I just want to quickly say that there are 4 types of attachments that have been identified, and that each one of us has one of these types of attachment. That is who we are. And they're developed as a result of the parenting styles that we grew up with. So the first one is secure attachment, and about 65% of the population is in this area. And this is when a parenting style has been consistently responsive to a child. So in a secure attachment has a child who seeks out and stays close to their parent, and they feel secure with that parent. The second type of attachment is avoidant, and about 20% of our population has avoidant attachment. And this comes from having a parental response that's consistently unresponsive. And so the child learns to avoid interaction and minimize their emotion when this is the environment they're growing up in. The third one is called ambivalent. And it's about 10 to 15% of the population. And this is about a parenting response style that is inconsistently responsive. And so children that fall into this area may cry to seek out the adult in their life, and then struggle when the adult is comforting them. And they may actually exaggerate their response to get their parent to give them attention. The last attachment style is called disorganized. And again, about 10 to 15% of the population fall into this range and have this attachment. And this attachment's about a parenting style that is frightening and emotionally unreachable. It's a consistent failure to respond appropriately. And what develops for a child in this environment is that the child becomes inconsistent. They also may be in that freeze mode a lot, and may have contradictory responses to the parent trying to comfort them because they're unsure. And they may exhibit things like pacing or rocking, those kinds of behaviors. So how this system, which is like this amazing system that our bodies of infants naturally do, and of what happens for parents, is that an infant has a need and they cry or fuss and they're in distress. And then their caregiver either meets that need and trust develops, or they go through that process and their caregiver does not meet that need and mistrust develops. And so what we know from attachment theory is that we all do this, and it's another piece of our development that carries forward with us. And if you think about this, when you're looking at this small area over here, what it says is the role of the adult is to always be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kinder. And the role of the child is to be going around this circle. It's to be with their secure base. It's to go out and explore. And I think many of you who are parents have seen this happen in real time. Go out and explore. They're doing something. They look back and all of a sudden, I'm a little scared. I'm a little worried. I don't know if I can do this. And then they want to come and run back. And then we reassure them and we send them back out to do the same thing again. And we actually keep doing this circle for our whole entire lives in different ways. So the third piece I want us to focus on for a second is the big battle and the big question. Is it nature or nurture? And it is both. And we know that now, that it is both, that it's all about what's going on with genetics, the environment, relationships, and connections. And we can, we're not going to get into a conversation about it, but it's worth mentioning epigenetics here, which is really about, how our genetic expression is, as we're responding, our genes are responding to the environment around us. So now not only do we know that it's nature and nurture, but we also know that our environment, which is changing all the time, that our genes are continuously interacting between the environment and our genes. So the nature and nurture thing. And we all know what happens in our bodies when we're stressed out, right? What goes on, our bodily response. Well, if you just take a moment and you think about what happens in our big human bodies, and then think about for infants and toddlers who don't have the words, who don't have the understanding that we have, stress is a huge factor around the nature and the nurture, right? So there are 3 kinds of stress that we talk about with children that are young children. We talk about positive stress. And for young children, positive stress means that it's you have this supportive relationship that helps you learn how to cope with everyday challenges. And your stress response in your body happens. And then you have this caring, loving, responsive adult that helps you work through that. And then your response system in your body returns to normal. So there's that positive stress, which we all feel, pretty much, I think, daily. Maybe not so much now as we're not driving long distances in cars to get to work. So we might have a little less stress than we had before. Then we have what's called tolerable stress that happens for young children. And this is around serious difficulties, like maybe being in a natural disaster, or the loss of a close family member, or you might have a frightening injury, like maybe there's a fire in the kitchen, or there's someone who falls down and hurts themselves. And in tolerable stress, again, a caring adult buffers the child and helps the child adapt. And this helps mitigate the potential damaging effects of abnormal levels of stress that may be happening. Because of course, with tolerable stress, some of those things may go on a little bit longer than just in that one moment. And the last type of stress that we talk about is toxic stress. And toxic stress is a strong, frequent, or prolonged adverse experience. And so you can think about that as extreme poverty, repeated abuse, that is experienced without a responsive, caring, supportive adult there to help the child work through it, to comfort them and help them make sense of it. It is this kind of prolonged stress and heightened levels of stress that can disrupt brain development and affect other organs in our bodies. And when very young children are in this kind of stress, it's the kind of stress that leaves ongoing damage that is another piece of early development that follows us over the course of our life, and also can create other issues in our lives. And that moves us into talking about the fact that everything in our bodies, we now know, is all completely connected. This is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. This is a recent publication that just came out this year, which is really important because it continues as they're uncovering the research to tell us about how everything's connected to everything. When I was a kid, we used to, I'm gonna age myself now, we used to sing this song called Dim Bones, and it was all about how everything in the body is connected. The backbone's connected to the neck bone's connected to the head bone. So everything's connected. And now what we're finding out through the research and the science is that that's true in the bodies of all of us, and it's especially true in the bodies of young children. So now we know more than ever about how our systems in our body interact with each other and the environment. And our system reads the environment and responds and actually shares that information with other systems in our bodies. So there's actually these signals that are being sent throughout our body that we're not even noticing, that are just happening on a daily basis as the environment and the experiences we're in are changing. So for very young children, the environments and the experiences that are created affect not just their brain development, but other systems in their bodies. And we know for very young children that, again, that elevated, prolonged state of toxic stress sets a foundation in place that throughout the span of a lifetime brings about a number of physical and emotional health issues over time. So all of this to say this, that our number one goal for the first 1,000 days, our number one goal for every single infant and toddler is that they be in safe, stable, nurturing families, homes, and communities. Now, another quote, one of my favorite ones from Maya Angelou. We're gonna move into talking about what we know. So we're gonna look at what we know, talk about for just a little bit about how we got here, get a glimpse into that, and then end by talking about what is it that we need to learn and to do. So what we know is an opportunity for me to share some data with you and to look at the data that we have around different pieces of early childhood and what we know about what's happening and trends and patterns that we're seeing around this. So I want to start by talking just for a second about healthcare spending in the United States. So as you can see by this chart, the United States spends the most on healthcare in comparison to other countries that are developed and have basically the same kind of money that we have in our country. So we're spending a lot of money on healthcare, but we're not getting the results that we should get from the amounts of money that we're spending, but we're treating the symptom. We don't think of healthcare as a holistic picture. We often think of healthcare as treating a sickness or disease or something that's wrong. So I want to share a little bit about what this means when we look at, for example, maternal mortality. So when you look at maternal mortality in the United States, we begin to see that we are at the bottom when we are compared to other countries, that 3 in 5 maternal deaths are preventable. 60% of maternal deaths are preventable. The March of Dimes recently did their report card on birth in America, and the US remains among the most dangerous developed nations for childbirth, and it's even more dire for women of color. So if you look over here, you can see that when we look at who is experiencing maternal mortality, that it's very high for African-American Black women, and it's also very high for American Indian, Alaska Native women. Then when we pivot to look at the other side of this, we often talk about maternal and infant mortality. You'll start to see how the trend builds. That when we talk about infant mortality, you will also see that the United States is ranked the lowest. We have the most infant deaths per 1,000 births. That African-American infants are 3.8 times more likely to die from complications related to low birth weight as compared to European American infants, or white infants. African Americans had over twice the sudden infant death syndrome in 2017 than their white counterparts. And so what we begin to see is a pattern that develops around looking at what's happening based on ethnicity in our system of healthcare. There was this study done that's called Giving Voice to Mothers. It was the first national study done in the United States that examines mistreatment during pregnancy and childbirth. And some of you may be surprised by a study that would examine mistreatment during the birthing process or during pregnancy. It was the first look at the birth experiences of people of color, and it was the first ever community-led study on the experience of childbirth in the United States. And this is what it found. It found that 1 in 6 women experience mistreatment during the birthing process, and that rate of mistreatment is even higher for women of color. So it's not like you had 0 in this response. What you had is the lowest percentage was 14, up to the highest percentage, which was 32 for Indigenous women. The top experiences of mistreatment included verbal abuse, stigma and discrimination, and delays and refusals in care. Some of you may be shocked to hear those kinds of things. I know that at the level this study went into, it really opened my eyes. I had had some of the experiences, but not nearly to the realm that some other women have had. Indigenous women were the most likely to report experience at least one form of mistreatment by healthcare providers, closely followed by Latinx or Latino women, and then by African American and Black women. So women who are giving birth, there's about 1/3 of women who are experiencing birth trauma. That means that through the actual birthing process, that they are traumatized by something. And you might wonder why 1 out of 3 women are experiencing birth trauma, which is something we often forget to address when we're doing services for a new mom, is to find out what her birth was like and whether it was a traumatic birth or not. So then when women were asked what the form of their trauma was, for 55% of them, they said it was a lack or loss of control during the birthing process. 50% said that there was a fear for their baby's life or their baby's health. 47% said they were experienced severe physical pain during the birthing process. And then 39% said there was not enough communication from a provider. And when this question was probed in other countries, one of the things that happened was that there was a response that many women thought that their healthcare provider put their needs above the birthing mom's needs. Like if they wanted to get out of the hospital, if the doc was ready to leave. And there was a consistent trend around not being heard and not being listened to. And in my job, every single day, one of the things that I see is when we get our press coverage from around the country, and they send us the blurbs, I every day am seeing something about what's happening around childbirth and what's happening around childbirth for birthing individuals that are of color and birthing individuals that are socioeconomically falling into poverty or living very low income. And so part of this trend that we see has to do with the intersection of ethnicity and the intersection of socioeconomic status. And speaking to that, let's look at poverty in America. And what I want to say is that as you look at this, you see how the trend continues in connecting to who has the highest levels of poverty, who has the highest levels of maternal and infant mortality. And what's surprising to know is that from 2010 to 2019, there's been very little change in the levels of poverty in our country. Everything has remained basically the same or close to the same. The last thing that I'd like to introduce in terms of looking at some of the bigger issues is to say that there is a racial disproportionality in the child welfare system. And I think a lot of people don't understand or know how the child welfare system works unless you're intimately involved with it. The highest number of kids interfacing with the child welfare system in our country are children under the age of 3. 41% of cases are under the age of 4. So there are a lot of very young children, children who are preverbal and don't have the words to talk about things. What we see in the data is that Indigenous groups, American Indian, Alaska Native, have the highest rates, followed by African American and Black children, and that there's overrepresentation of both these ethnic groups in the child welfare system when compared to their representation in the general population. So one of the things that the research has shown us is that we know that there's a bias in the reporting of child abuse, which has been documented. So when someone is looking, I know we've all heard of implicit bias. When somebody is looking at a child and wondering what could be going on, there's a bias from a narrative that sets in for people as they're looking at children from different socioeconomic statuses and also from different ethnic groups. Somewhere from 65 to 75% of cases in the child welfare system under the age of 4 are in the category of neglect only, which means there was no physical abuse, there was no sexual abuse, that it's neglect, which is defined differently in each state slightly, but across the board, it's a failure of a parent or other person with responsibility for the child to provide needed food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision to the degree that the child's health, safety, and well-being are threatened. Of the cases that are neglect, it's from 65 to 75% of the cases, 46% of those children are under the age of 4 that were connected to a caregiver who was an adult with a substance abuse disorder. So we have a large percentage, almost half, that are connected to somebody with a substance abuse disorder, and very often that may be or a mental health issue. So infants and toddlers are removed from their homes at a rate more than double that of children ages 4 to 17. And if you think back to what I said, that we have to remember the brain development during this stage of time. And the number one thing, safe, stable, nurturing families, homes, and communities, you can see that what's going on with our child welfare system is not in line and not aligned with what we know about what's best for developing brains. And so there's a lot of work that's going on around this particular issue in terms of getting developmentally appropriate processes and policies when we look at very young children in the child welfare system. So now I'd like to focus just for a couple of minutes on talking about disproportionality in our pandemic. From both of these graphs, you're going to see from the top one in the blue, this one is basically about people who are at higher risk for serious illness by ethnicity. And in the graph in the green, it's for people who are at risk for serious illness if infected by coronavirus by economic status. So you see the two trends that we've been seeing in everything else that was very specific to early childhood in the first 1,000 days. That trend continues. And then we've been involved with something called the Rapid Early Childhood Project, which is at the University of Oregon, that has been looking at, since we started in the pandemic, weekly surveys of parents across the United States, of families across the United States. And what you see here is looking at material hardship and economics, you begin to see the same pattern coming out through the pandemic. And one of the things that we are seeing a lot about what the pandemic has done is it's really laid bare all of the inequities that exist in our system and made it very clear the disproportionality that happens because of those inequities. So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about how we got here. And so this is absolutely not enough time, as I said before when I first started, to break this down and look at all of the issues around racism and classism and the intersection of these issues, or the history of systemic racism. But it's important to introduce it because all of the trends that we just saw are directly connected to the systems that we've developed. So this is just a snippet, and I only have 3 slides here. So my first slide is going to show you the historical timeline for indigenous peoples in our country. Now, when you look at this historical timeline, you're going to see that it was in 1961 that the Self-Determination Act happened for American Indians, Native Americans in our country. So from what is called the founding of the United States, there are 2 ethnic groups that have experienced extreme, harsh, unspeakable, and inhumane treatment beginning in the 1600s and the 1700s. The first group is American Indians. So when you look at this, it's 59 years since self-determination happened. The next slide I want to show you is about African Americans and the experience of enslavement in the United States. 55 years since the Civil Rights Act. So basically, for both indigenous communities and Black African American communities in what is called the United States, 87% of the experience has been under explicit racial oppression, and 100% of the experience has been what we're terming a struggle for humanity, equality, and equity. And this is really important because it leads to why we see the results that we see, why we see what we call racial disparities. And this is important because how we've structured our systems and how those systems do or don't work for different groups of people. And the systems were created and they actually gave opportunity for some and took opportunity and didn't give opportunity to others. And so we live with those same systems today because we haven't really created new systems. We've built on the systems that were built from the beginning. And some things have changed in them. There's probably 1,000 times more policies today than there were years ago. But we've been building on those systems. So the issue here is that we have a systemic racism. We have systemic classism. It can also be called structural racism or institutional racism, but it's really about the systems and the structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage a certain group of people and don't disadvantage another group of people. So it's really embedded in our normal practice within our society and within organizations. Glenn Harris, who's the president of Race Forward and the publisher of Color Lines, defined it as the complex interaction of culture, policy, and institutions that holds in place the outcomes we see in our lives. This statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics that came out in 2019 is very important because it starts to show the deep understanding that pediatricians are getting over time about the effects of racism on young children and the ability for there to be health and well-being for young children. So what that leads us to is that we have these 2 things that come together and that are intersecting. There's the experiences, environments, and the systemic systems and structures and discrimination and marginalization. And what they have resulted in and what we see today is what we call social determinants of health, that are conditions in the places where people live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of their health, risk, and outcomes. This definition is from the CDC. And then we have adverse childhood experiences and environments. And that is all of what the work that Virginia and Danielle and Maureen are doing is around these kinds of things. And adverse childhood experiences are all types of experience of abuse, neglect, or other traumatic experiences that occur before you're 18. And then we have to look at things like also adverse environments, such as living in poverty, community disruption, community violence, poor housing, lack of opportunity and discrimination in people's lives. That all of these things in childhood coming together, everything we talked about brain development and all the development that's happening for very young children, all these things in childhood can affect later life and the course of our life. And it affects us not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. So we do have to rethink, we have to unlearn, and then we have to relearn. And so I am running out of time, and I know that, to my colleagues that are on the phone with me. So I'm going to have to quickly go through this. But we cannot solve the problems of today with the same thinking we used when we created them, is one of the things that Albert Einstein has said. And it's not a hill, it's a mountain. As YouTube says in their song when we start the climb. And I want to talk about what needs to change. So here's what we need to focus on. We have got to change people's mental models. Very often where we're working is at the policy and the practice level and the money level. Every once in a while we get into the relationship and connections, and we're starting more to talk about power dynamics, but the secret sauce for transformation is in our mental models. That's where we hold our thinking and our belief and all of the narratives that we have about people and things. And so if we're going to transform our systems, we have to transform these mental models. And we know that stigma drives many of the mental models. And so we have these stigma narratives that are created about other people. And those stigma narratives look something like these four popular ones. Those people want privileges they have not earned. Any gains by them is a loss for us. They brought it on themselves, or the problems that they represent must be neutralized. They must be removed. So those are the four most popular stigma narratives that are running around in people's middle models. So that means we have to change the narrative. We have to change the story. We also have to focus on what we know now to be the core things that have to happen. We talked about stress. We have to reduce sources of stress. We have to support the relationship, attachment and bonding. We have to support responsive, nurturing, caring relationships between infants, toddlers, and their caregivers. And we have to strengthen what's called core life skills. And core life skills are around executive functioning, the ability to regulate, to set goals and meet them, to manage our behavior, to set up routines for kids. All of those things have to be happening in order for children to develop physically, cognitive, and social emotionally with their skills. Now we know how clear this is. The Center for the Developing Child has now said that we have to remove chronic adversity. So that means we have to confront poverty, racism, violence, all those things that I was talking about earlier, everything that falls into a social determinant or an adverse child experience or an adverse environment. That we have to move our work upstream. It has to be a public health approach. We have to get all the way upstream and address the issues before people are falling into the cracks or falling out of the system. And then the other thing we have to do is that we have to do this not only by looking at science, but also listening to lived experience of the people that are in the systems that we are making policies for and creating. So that is an extremely important piece of this work. We have to look at policies that are effective, and we have to look at strategies that are effective. We work with something called the Prenatal to 3 Policy Impact Center. And these are the effective policies and the effective strategies that they've identified that we can do within our states, within our country, that will actually get us to what we're looking for, starting to create and make happen those stable, nurturing environments for children on a regular basis. So here's the things that are most important in doing this. We want to center equity and social justice intentionally and with purpose in our work. It's not enough for it to be a strategy that we put over there. It has to be a strategy through which we're working every single thing that we're doing. We also want to apply an asset-based thinking frame at all times in all settings. And what that really means is we have to get away from thinking about the person or the community as the problems they may have, but thinking about the people as the people first and the problems second. It's very easily said, very, very hard to do. I have been working on this very consciously even more during 2020 and realizing even the way that we ask for people to describe the work they're going to do in a community, we're asking for them to describe that in a negative way most of the time. So what is the problem you're trying to address? Every grant says, what is the problem you're trying to address? What is the data to that problem? So if we start to think about who are these people, what are their aspirations for their children? What are their aspirations for themselves, for their community? It's a very different way of approaching what we're doing. We have to use targeted universalism. We want to see, as you heard me say in the beginning, the work that we're doing is about every child. We may be, but we are also focused on making sure that children who are living in poverty with the lowest incomes are getting the access that they need and their families need to services. So this is about saying that it's not about everybody getting what's equal, it's about everybody getting what they need, what's equitable, in order for them to make it to the place that we want to see everybody make it to. Here is the piece about parent, family, and community voice. We have got to center equity, and centering equity means that we're centering lived experience and the voice of community members. I have said for so many years in early childhood, if you build it, they may not come. It's not baseball. It's not a sporting event. It is so possible to start this new great program that you think is the answer and then not have people in the community signing up for it for a variety of different reasons. And the next place that we're going to go has some to do with those reasons, that we have to remember that place matters, relationship matters, and trust matters. And that racial, cultural, and language concordance matters. One of the most alarming pieces of research that came out this year was a piece of research that said that Black infants have a 2.3 times higher infant mortality if their primary care physician, their pediatrician, is white. So what that says is there is something in this piece about relationship, lived experience, and congruence in that does make a difference. The other thing that we have to do, which is what we started from the very beginning talking about, was addressing trauma, being trauma informed, and looking at different types of trauma, intergenerational, the collective trauma, and the trauma that comes transgenerational, which is what we're talking about when I showed you the timeline for Indigenous communities and for African-American Black communities. We're talking about transgenerational trauma that has happened. We also have to approach our work from a psychosocial aspect. We have to look at not only psychological factors, but the surrounding social environment, and look at all of those things together. And that also means what we have to focus in on is mental, emotional, social, and spiritual dimensions of health. And that's one of the spiritual dimensions is one of the things we rarely ever talk about when we're working in and with communities. And lastly, but certainly not least, is we have to look at competencies that are equity focused for staff that are working with communities. Very often we don't have racial concordance and we don't have language concordance or cultural concordance. So how are we making sure that we have competencies that are equity focused? And then we need an equity focused workforce. So the last words I want to leave you with are the words of Frederick Douglass and some more words from Uri Bronfenbrenner. And that is all of my formal presentation. I'm going to end my slideshow. stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Hello, I think we're together again.
I think we are.
Brenda, thank you so much for that comprehensive and dynamic presentation. You covered so much. I'm still taking it all in. I'm going to be sort of absorbing this for a while. You know, as you point out, you know, the speed of light, the urgency, the sense of urgency that this needs to happen now, and that we have to center equity in how to consider the workforce. There's so much richness here. I can't unpack it all, but you know, where we are now is particularly troubling in this, you know, COVID-19 environment, because I have to think about the parents who are at home. Mm-hmm. And they're, you know, now they're the professional educators, our young ones, you know, looking beyond the 1,000 days, they're, you know, they're at home with parents. So as I was listening, I was really thinking about that. And so the PCI initiative for preparing everyone for kindergarten, having them ready, I'm just wondering, how is that impacted by this new environment? I know there's specific benchmarks, you know, labeled for 2023, and where we are now and where we can be in 2023. I'm wondering about, you know, any changes, disruptions, interference that are COVID-19 specific, and keeping in mind a sense of urgency. What do we do about that?
Yes, it's a very good question. So it's very interesting that our work has not slowed down, not for one single minute, not for one single day. In fact, many of the states we're working with are talking about how much harder they feel they're working now. And in many of our states, the work's pushing forward. And some things are a little bit harder to deal with, right? Especially with the fact that states are looking at being in a loss of funds for the next 3 years. So they're saying that the recovery is going to be slow. And that, but for some states, it has really propelled their work forward. And so one of the biggest issues that has come out through the pandemic has been around childcare. And so for some states, the childcare crisis has brought to the forefront the fragileness of the childcare industry itself. And many people, especially business people, are starting to understand the importance of childcare in terms of having workers for jobs and being able to open back up the economy. And if childcare businesses are going away, which throughout the pandemic, some have disappeared and they're never coming back. And childcare is in almost all places, has been hanging on by a thread. So with that specific issue, you're getting a lot of action around it. You're getting a lot of movement around it. You're getting people changing policy because now they understand in an extremely different way what childcare means to the working of the rest of the population. It's interesting that, you know, that moves into also some concerns because infant toddler spaces cost more than spaces for preschoolers or older children. And there's also been some movement of people that weren't childcare providers moving into the childcare space and taking over childcare. But there's also been some movement of people who may have had more infant toddler spaces thinking about, well, maybe I should convert the space. So making sure we still hold on to high quality infant toddler spaces is really very important. There is just a piece that came out last month called Children of Quarantine. What does a year of isolation and anxiety do to a developing brain? And I encourage everyone to go find it and read it. It is very sobering what it talks about.
Could you repeat the title for us?
Yes, it's Children of Quarantine. What does a year of isolation and anxiety do to a developing brain?
I see that there are 13 questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask one more and then turn it over to our Q&A moderator. So to address how we got here, I so appreciated the background, right? We're talking decades, I mean, actually centuries ago when this process started, right? And you're saying 1961, here are changes, here are laws that we're still dealing with. I'm wondering, in this history lesson, like how important is it to our understanding of where this country began and the country's history to understanding what's next, right? How do we, because again, I mean, in terms of the history, there's certainly deaf ears and, you know, all of the stigma that you just shared with us. How can we, as, you know, the 80 plus who are with you right now, consider how to integrate the history and the information into the steps that we want to take forward?
I think that we have to understand the systems we created that gave opportunity to some and not to others, that today those systems do exactly what they were meant to do. Our systems were not built to serve everyone. They were, especially our education system. And so we always are talking about education reform, education reform.
Mm.
We have to look at the systems for what they are and then ask the question about what are the results that we're getting from the system. So that's why we have to be very data driven. And then we can start, one of the places we can start is by asking the 5 whys. The 5 why process is to help get to what's the root cause. Because if we're not dealing with root causes, then the trends that we see continue. So we want to get to root cause, which is getting upstream. And you ask the question why 5 times. So every time you answer it, you ask why to that answer. And you just keep going a level deeper. I think that, you know, what's really hard about this is that Martin Luther King made a speech where he talked about the other America. There's always been an other America. There still is an other America. And we have had our eyes open to that a lot in 2020. But we have to keep looking at it, and we have to keep asking ourselves the questions about how we get here and what the systemic pieces are that we need to change. And that means every single one of us taking it upon ourselves to do our part to change these systems. Because if we don't, what we have is babies and children that are coming into a system that already has them not able to achieve what they could achieve. And this is all about, I mean, I don't like to talk about the opportunity gap just because it's a phrasing that I doesn't sit well with me, but it is about having opportunities, which means having access to an ability to engage. And if those things are not in your environment and in your community, then that means that you don't have those opportunities. We are still a very segregated country. And I will say the one thing that has changed in the pandemic, there's been some research that people now view government assistance in a different way. They're looking at government assistance differently. That there are so many people that need to get help with food and rent and their mortgage and all of these things, that there has been a shift. Now, will that shift stay? We don't know, but we know that we've now seen a shift in the population.
That's really interesting. So I have to say that as a trauma researcher, I'd really be remiss if I didn't sort of follow up on, maternal mortality, infant mortality. You talked about verbal abuse in the space where women go to get their care. You talked about the trauma of childbirth for many, and we know, I've seen the data that, the trauma for Black women and Indigenous women, much higher rates. There's a researcher at Mass General at Harvard, Sharon Deckel, who's doing a lot of work in this area. And I'm just wondering, so in this context of childbirth, for many being a space that could be potentially traumatic, right? Your life's at risk in some cases, your child's life's at risk. What does that do in terms of welcoming in, what we usually consider these really positive experiences, childbirth, a baby's on the way, but for many, it is a space of trauma. What does that do for parents, for families, for communities?
Yeah, so, this is one of the places where we don't have a lot of research about what the effect is. What we do know is that there's potential social and economic consequences of maternal mortality. Some of them are obvious. If you have the loss of resources, and so almost across the board, we see that consumption among a household where there's been a maternal death it goes down because there's generally a loss of income into the house. We know that there can be a risk of mortality for children when their mother dies, that raises the risk that they may also die. We also know that responsibilities shift as a result of it, and that there may be older children that then have to assume more responsibility in the household. We also know that there are mental health problems, feelings of depression and isolation that come with the loss of a mom that has just given birth. So it's really this multifaceted spillover of physical, mental, emotional, and health issues for the family, as well as economic. But then also just imagine the father who now has lost their partner and also has this new baby, that everything that I talked about, the attention, all of those things that need to be there, who's grieving at the same time that they have this child. And if they have other children, older children, who are grieving also. So it changes everything within the dynamic of that family. And then within the community, depending on how tight-knit the community is, it can have a definite change in terms of what happens in the community.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for entertaining my questions. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Danielle Cassaw to moderate the Q&A. I have to say, though, I noticed one question in the chat from Fran, who talked about a birthing experience recently. And as someone who was in the birthing room with my own child some years ago, I just empathize with what that experience can be like, particularly as it turns out, for Black women and Indigenous women in labor. So I really empathize. I would like to introduce to everyone Dr. Danielle Cassaw. She's the Senior Program Officer for Trauma Free NYC at Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Cassaw is an early childhood development expert. She is a research scientist, a licensed school teacher, and was formerly an executive leader on the pre-K team with NYC Department of Education. Her work focuses on early childhood learning and the impact of adverse childhood experiences on health and life outcomes. Welcome, Danielle.
Hi, thank you. So Brenda and Dr. Allwood, thank you so much. Brenda, there are so many accolades in the Q&A box and thank yous from the different participants.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that Maureen mentioned the comment from Fran, because Fran's experience was from 30 years ago, and she experienced mistreatment. And so clearly there's a long history to this. I mean, obviously you talked about the history. So maybe you could comment on, if, especially since the data is so devastating to think about, but are we making progress anywhere? I know it's
so we're not making the progress that we need to make around maternal and infant mortality and what's happening for Brown and Black women and babies. That is a place where we need to make much more progress, where we need to really lean in and concentrate on transforming systems. And there are pieces of work happening. And then we might find a community where they're making a difference, but we need to make that difference across the broad spectrum of the whole entire country. And I have to say that one of the hardest things for me with my work is probably every day seeing a headline coming through my email that is about, you know, how our maternal mortality in our country is so awful, and that brown and black women are dying at high rates. And in some places, it's 3 and 4 times deaths for black women than their white counterparts. And so it is definitely, we're not moving fast enough. We are putting many, many things in place. I think that the more that the average person is aware of what happens with birthing in our country, and the more that we have educated our elected officials at the state level and at the federal level, the more progress we will make. And again, I just have to go back and say, we've got to change the mental models that people operate in. What's their narrative? You know, our narrative, just switching to a different subject for just a second, our narrative about calling child welfare when we see something is that, oh, this child needs help and they're going to get help if I call child welfare, when that is not the case all the time. They don't get the help that they need quite often.
Yeah. Let me see. I want to also ask you, before I forget, there were a couple of requests for citations, the study citations on some of the different data pieces. So maybe that's something we could share after.
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
we could work with that. Yeah.
And I also want to mention to the audience that several people asked about whether they would have access to this event. We are recording it. And if you would please, if you go to the chat box, our colleague at the Center for Science and Society put his email in there. It's js5055@columbia.edu. And if you emailed Joseph, you could stay notified about when the video is going to be uploaded, and you can watch it again and have access. So there are a couple of really thought-provoking questions about parenting and racism, and they're all connected. And so there's two, I'm going to read both of them because they both have many important points and I don't want to miss anything. So the first one asks, parental involvement and behavior is crucial in the development in the early days. I don't think racism has anything to do with that. How do we educate parents to not create handicaps in their children's development? And then the next person asks, knowing that racism in all its forms is toxic, fatally so, knowing that racism arrests child development emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, psychologically, and even neurologically and genetically, what will be put into place and what consequences will be put into place for those who continue in a dedicated fashion to participate in racism? So there's one question about parental involvement and behavior in the early days, and that that the person doesn't perceive racism having to do with that, but how can parents not create handicaps? And then the other person is asking that we know that racism is toxic and that it does impact a person's development in all different ways. And how do we deal with these different issues?
So let me try and take a go at the question in terms of the person who said, I don't think that racism has anything to do with that, with parental involvement and behavior. And so there is, when you think about the effect, and this goes back to thinking about trauma and intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. And my caveat is that I am not a trauma expert, but I have been paying a lot of attention to this over the years, and for a number of years have worked on different projects with Danielle, Dr. Casal, where we were looking at the issues around trauma. And I think it's important to understand that as a result of racism in our country, parents African American parents have also learned certain ways to adapt that were protective for their children. So, for example, I'm sure that everybody has heard of the talk. It's the talk that Black families have with their children when they're young about when they're getting to be, more independent, which is about if you're ever stopped by the police, here are the things that you have to do. Had the talk with both my kids. We had the talk at a family reunion with all of my nieces, nephews, and cousins young when they were young, sitting in a room together, explaining to them what they needed to do. That is a result of racism. If there was not racism that happened and was perpetuated and that people experienced, the talk wouldn't be happening. Also, the protective nature that we see of not wanting children to act out in any way in public, from the time when if a Black child ran away or bumped into a white person, or all those things that could lead to that child being hurt, possibly killed, or the parent being held responsible for the child's behavior. So in that way, what I want to say is that actually racism does affect that connection. It does affect how the parenting happens, because you have this transgenerational trauma that says, I have to protect you. I have to keep you safe. And that transfers into parenting in certain ways to keep a child safe.
Yeah.
Based off of the fact that racism exists.
Yeah. And so before you get to the second question, I'm glad that you brought up the intergenerational piece, because there was another question, and if Dr. Rauh is still here, she might be able to help us with it. But there was a question about, gosh, there's so many great questions, and now I have to find it where it went. It was about epigenetics and the science around being able to measure the intergenerational pieces. And my understanding is there's still some infancy in that work, but Dr. Rauh, can you comment on epigenetics and how we can measure intergenerational trauma?
Mm-hmm. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Great. I didn't see the question, so I don't know specifically what it concerns, but the intersection of environment and heredity is a very important topic, not only in the area of environmental health, which is an area where we're considering the impact of the wider environment, which includes the social environment, and in some cases, the built environment and the chemical environment. But over time, you have a confluence of influences on the organism. And in fact, what happens and what epigenetics is in part about is the passing on to another generation. Changes that really affect the biology and then go on to have an impact in the next generation as a result of some simple consequences of certain types of early parenting behavior and certain types of exposures. So I would just say that there's a robust field of research out there that involves the whole field of epigenetics. Some of it involves animal studies, and others involve human studies, and it's very fascinating, and I would encourage people to look into it. If folks are interested in getting some references, I think we'd be glad to provide that.
Thank you, Dr. Rauh. It's 5:56, and Brenda and Maureen, if we have a few more minutes, we might be able to answer the second part of that question. And then if folks have to go, the recording will be available. But so getting back to that second question about how toxic racism is, and fatally so, and the impact on a person's child development, and all aspects of development, and what are the consequences of that, And, particularly, I think the question is asking for, when there's racism is continuing to happen, and just that continued impact on child development. What are the consequences?
So I think, and I'm no expert in this either. There is research, and I just sat in on some sessions that happened to 0 to 3, the National 0 to 3 conference, which is the preeminent conference for people who work with kids, infants and toddlers. And I sat in on a workshop that was about the effects of racism on children. And it was very interesting to me to learn that they are seeing that children by 18 months have preferences for people based on ethnicity and color of their skin.
Yeah.
And it was actually, they had recreated the Black Doll study in Italy and got the same results that they got in America. And so it really started me thinking about just trying to understand more the effects that are happening and what the consequences are for children. And one of the pieces of the consequences is that I was reading about, which is a loss of hope. So if you have this loss of hope, you lose motivation. You can't see yourself being able to achieve things that you see other people achieving. And, for my whole lifetime, I grew up and it was like, never in a million years did we think that there would be an African-American president, or brown or Black president, right? And when President Obama got elected, my kids were young. And I was able for the first time to ever say, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be president of the United States if you wanted to be. Neither one of my kids wanted that and did not aspire to that. But it was the first time that you could say that. So I think that there is, a lot of research that tells us that what's happening in preschools in terms of expulsions or kicking kids out, the treatment that happens to brown and Black boys is very different than the treatment that happens to white boys. And so I think that we see that the result is that it's I can't remember the quote. There's an actual quote that Martin Luther King has when he talks about it. But he talks about, when he talks about the two Americas that exist, he talks about the young people who grow up in the sunlight of opportunity versus the young people that grow up. What does it do to little children that are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies? And that just really touched me. I think that we think that children don't know what's happening and what's going on around them, but they absorb it, and they do. And then the stress that presents for the parents. I mean, it's parenting, as we all know, is hard work. When you add to that living in poverty, experiencing racism, experiencing sexism, you're adding on more and more to what's already a difficult job for all of us to do.
Yeah. Prior to the pandemic starting, there was some research coming out that showed the number one stress for Black people in America is racism. And so it clearly, we know it doesn't go away, and it starts in early childhood. So
it does. And we also know, I think it's important when we talk about maternal mortality, when we talk about what's happening for Black women, that it's not about being an African-American woman living in poverty. It's about being an African-American woman. African-American women that have advanced degrees, graduate degrees, have worse birthing outcomes than their white counterparts that have less education. And so what if people only walk away with one clear picture from this, it's that poverty is not a leveling field. Poverty still has the intersection of racism, which then separates people in poverty into ethnic categories. And the research has told us this for years and years and years, and continues to show the same trends.
Well, unfortunately, there are so many great questions. We're not going to be able to get to them right now. Maybe we could follow up with some of them afterwards, but I'm going to turn things back to Dr. Allwood. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I will turn over to Pamela shortly. So I do want to point out that in those two questions on racism, one sort of centered racism on the systemic, structural, and the other, I think, centered around maybe racist acts. And I think we just have to point out that those are two very different conceptualizations around racism. So when we talk about women who have to gauge which hospital they can go to have their child because they might be treated differently at one versus the other, then you have to consider which physician your infant can go to for their medical care, because the outcomes differ between, what you decide when you have to decide which school district and where your child might thrive and where they might not survive. I mean, those are the structural things that families are dealing with. It's not whether there's a racist moment, it's whether there's a context that really dictates everything about your life. If you want to go on a family trip, you have to gauge where that might be and where that cannot be. And it's really difficult, I think, for when that's not your story, to understand that these are the everyday living, breathing moments that people experience. And it's not a child rearing moment, it's an entire context that you've presented so beautifully to us.
Excellent point.
So much for your presentation today. Again, I'll be taking this on and absorbing it and considering it for some time to come. Thank you for everyone for being here with us. And I'm going to turn over now to Pamela Smith to have final words. And again, thank you, Brenda. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists today. It was a wonderful and important group of talks and questions, and I really appreciate you all spending the time, with this really, really important work. I want to thank all of I also wanted to mention, I wanted to thank Maureen particularly for underscoring the systemic nature of, these issues. And to just note that I think this morning a RAND study came out that showed just how much the disparity in income has grown over the last 45 years, and that poverty has actually increased really just in a really significant way over the last 45 years. So these are problems that are not getting better in the short term, but I really appreciate all of your work for, addressing them and informing us about them today. I want to thank all of the audience members for staying with us and for asking such great questions. And I hope that you will sign up to hear about our events in the coming spring semester. Thank you all, and thanks again.